I welcome you all again for this wonderful Karnataka ENT Hospital Innovative Masterclass series. We have as I told you, small change in the program. I have invited my good friend, one of the most knowledgeable friend I've met from nuclear medicine specialty, Dr. Murali Ramarao Nadi. He is an alumnus of prestigious Mysore Medical College, and he completed internship there only, and he did nuclear MD in nuclear medicine from one of the most premier institute of India, that is All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Also, he was a radiation safety officer subsequently. Okay, and after completing his senior residency from AIMS, he has been consultant nuclear radiologist, teleradiology solutions in Bangalore, and with the Scintillon and Clumax diagnosis, and also PET CT Apollo hospitals. And now he is founder, director, and chief consultant of NewMed Diagnostics at Bangalore. He has more than 10 international publications, and he is member of many associations, received many awards, and he has traveled a lot, and is life member of many national and international associations. I really feel privileged and proud to bring in Murali Nadik today to deal with this one of the very important topic. We know very less about it. What we do generally, we just refer and forget it. That shouldn't happen. Rather, we should have first-hand information. That's why I have called in Dr. Murali today. Welcome, Dr. Murali.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thanks for those kind words. And this is a great opportunity. Every one of us is going through a crisis, but we are turning this crisis into an opportunity. I hope everybody is doing well, and we'll hope this crisis will end soon and we will resume the life as it was earlier. Okay, and
If anybody has questions, please post on the chat. We will discuss in the end.
Yeah. Okay. Shall I start then?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Today we will talk about the role of nuclear medicine in management of thyroid disorders. Before I start, I just want to give brief introduction about what is nuclear medicine. Just 1 second. Yeah. So I want to give brief introduction about nuclear medicine. So what is nuclear medicine is we use short-lived radioisotopes for imaging and therapy. So these most commonly used isotopes are technetium-99m, thallium-201, gallium-67, gallium-68, fluorine-18, iodine-131, etc. And these isotopes can emit different types of radiation. If the isotopes emit high energy radiation like alpha or beta rays, we use it for therapy. If they emit low energy rays like gamma rays or positron, which in turn gets converted into photons, we use it for imaging. So these radio tracers can be combined with different chemical substances, which we call as pharmaceutical substances, to form radiopharmaceutical substances. For example, technetium is labeled with DTPA or DMSA or MDP, or iodine-131 is labeled with MIBG and many other substances. F18 is labeled with fluorodeoxyglucose. And this, when is labeled, it is called as radio tracer or radiopharmaceutical, and it is administered by different routes in the body, and the movement of the tracer in the body can be traced by a principle called as tracer principle, which was invented by Georg von Hevesy, and most of the physiological processes and biochemical processes were understood by this tracer principle, and he was honored with Nobel Prize in 1943. And the imaging is also called as autoradiography, because the patient is emitting radiation, unlike in general radiology where we transmit radiation across the patient. In nuclear medicine, patient himself will be emitting radiation. Therefore, it is also called as autoradiography. So what we do is the radio tracers are produced and in nuclear reactors or cyclotrons, and then they are shipped through different self-shielded containers, and from them we extract the radioactivity every day. This is called as elution, and this is labeled with different substances and administered into the body. But depending upon the body, how it handles the pharmaceutical substance, we use it for different organ imaging. For example, in the case of evaluating brain, we use somatostatin receptors or different radio receptors with technetium or other radionuclides. For brain perfusion, we use a tracer called as ECD. For heart, we use Cestum EB or pyrophosphate. For lungs, we use macro aggregated albumin. For liver, we use HIDA or sulfur chloride. For evaluation of kidneys, we use DTPA or EC and DMSA. For bones, we use MDP. Like this, for different organs, we use different radiopharmaceutical substances. And today, our main concern is application of nuclear medicine in thyroid practice. See, nuclear medicine has played a very important role in understanding thyroid physiology as well as diagnosing and treating thyroid disorders. So many a times I call what a cardiologist does on every aspect of cardiac problem. The similar way nuclear medicine plays a very important role in every aspect of evaluating thyroid disorders. For example, in the evaluation of thyroid disorders, the hormone assay was initially developed as a nuclear medicine technique, that is radioimmunoassay. And the same principle was later extrapolated to chemiluminescence assay, and that is what we are currently using for T3, T4, and TSH analysis. In fact, Burson and Diallo were two scientists who got a Nobel Award for radioimmunoassay invention also. And next is in imaging. We use different radiopharmaceuticals, technetium-99m pertechnetate or iodine-123 sodium iodide scan, iodine-131 scan, technetium-99m labeled with Cestum EB or F18-FDG. And for therapy, again, nuclear medicine plays important role in thyrotoxicosis as well as differentiated thyroid cancer. Now coming to imaging, thyroid scintigraphy is used in evaluation of thyrotoxicosis. We can use technetium-99m as well as iodine-123. Iodine-123 is an ideal radio tracer because it mimics exactly how the body handles iodine in the body. But iodine-123 is not available all over the world. It needs a separate cyclotron for the production, and its half-life is very short, only 13 hours. So that makes it difficult for transportation all across the world, and therefore we are not using iodine-123. But in most of the places, technetium-99m has substituted iodine-123 for evaluation of thyrotoxicosis. Iodine-131 can also be used, but iodine-131 produces higher energy radiation with beta rays, and it has more therapeutic advantage than diagnostic advantage. The evaluation of thyroid nodule also, technetium thyroid scan plays an important role. In suspected ectopic thyroid tissue and congenital hypothyroidism are other indications. So what is the difference between technetium and radioactive iodine? Is that radioiodine is trapped and bound inside the thyroid follicular cells. That means it is transported across the thyroid follicular cells by sodium iodide importer, and inside the thyroid follicular cell it is organified by the action of thyroid peroxidase enzyme. Then it is incorporated into thyroglobulin and then converted into T3 and T4, and then it is released back into the circulation. Whereas technetium is only trapped. It is transported inside the cells by same sodium iodide importer, but subsequent action by thyroid peroxidase enzyme, it is not a substrate and it is not organified. So what happens is it is taken up rapidly, but it also washes out of the thyroid gland early. It has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are we can use it for imaging immediately after radio tracer injection. Whereas with radioiodine, there is a progressive uptake, and for radioactive iodine uptake study, we use gamma probes and we use it at 24 hours after the administration of radioiodine. So that is a cumbersome method for routine practice. So most of the places, technetium has replaced radioiodine for evaluation of thyrotoxicosis. There are two more differences. Iodine is gradually taken up by the gland, and the uptake is also higher than technetium. So we have evolved a range of around 5 to 15% at 2 hours and 15 to 35% at 24 hours. Again, this data is old data because after universal iodization, the iodine uptake is relatively less. In technetium pertechnetate case, the normal range of uptake is only 0.4 to around 4%, but it correlates with radioactive iodine uptake, and it is easily available and imaging is possible. Therefore, it is more practical. So this is how a normal technetium protected image looks like. The thyroid gland in the neck looks like a butterfly shaped structure. There is a normal background activity and some amount of salivary gland activity, submandibular glands and parotid glands are seen, and also some amount of excreted activity in oral cavity is also seen. So now coming to the most commonly encountered problem in clinical scenario where nuclear medicine plays important role is thyrotoxicosis. So before directly proceeding into imaging findings, I want to give you two examples. See, this is how patients are often presented in our clinical case settings. So this is one 55-year-old female patient with a long-standing euthyroid goiter with recent onset of weight loss, sweating, anxiety, palpitations since 1 month, and hormone profile was typical of hyperthyroidism. That is TSH low and T3 and T4 were elevated. And as usual, before they were referred to us, the patient had already undergone an ultrasound scan which showed both lobes are enlarged with increased vascularity with multiple hyperechoic nodules. Okay, this is another patient, 35-year-old housewife with symptoms of toxicosis, that is weight loss, tremors, anxiety. So on examination, there was a bossulated goiter and hormone profile again was not significantly different from the previous patient, and ultrasound also was not significantly different. But how do you diagnose further? What further investigations are needed? So what happens typically is these patients are simply put on antithyroid drugs, either neomertazole or carbimazole, and followed up later. But is it the way it has to be done? No. See, in case one, when they were referred for nuclear medicine scintigraphic technique, you can see we did a technetium protected rate scan. There is markedly reduced uptake by the thyroid parenchyma. The background activity and salivary gland activity is increased, and 20-minute uptake was less than 0.05%, or it is almost nil. There is no uptake in the gland. Whereas in the latter case, the gland was uniformly enlarged, and there is diffuse increased tracer uptake by the gland, and there is some amount of activity seen along the pyramidal tract, thyroglossal tract also. So this, and the uptake at 20 minutes was around 20%. See, as I said, the normal range is 0.3 to 3% or 0.4 to 4%, whereas in this patient the uptake was 20%. So these two are now two different entities. One is thyrotoxicosis. Both are clinically thyrotoxicosis, but pathogenesis of these two conditions are different. So therefore, it is very important to understand the pathogenesis and also classify the thyrotoxicosis. See, we have to know the difference between thyrotoxicosis and hyperthyroidism. Thyrotoxicosis is a constellation of symptoms because of excessive thyroid hormone circulation in the blood, whereas hyperthyroidism is one of the reasons for thyrotoxicosis, where the gland is the reason for excess hormones in the blood. So therefore, it is important to differentiate thyrotoxicosis as high uptake thyrotoxicosis. The high uptake can be of iodine or technetium protected, or low uptake thyrotoxicosis, because the pathogenesis, the behavior and natural history of these two conditions are different. For example, in case of low uptake thyrotoxicosis, usually it happens because of viral illnesses or autoimmune conditions where there is destruction of gland, and initially there is excess hormones released into the circulation because of the gland destruction, and T3, T4 are elevated and TSH is suppressed. And in this setting, patients can have frank or mild forms of clinical symptoms like weight loss, hair loss, tremors, anxiety, palpitations, sleep disturbances, anger, and other such conditions. But over a period of time, the thyroid hormones in the circulation will reduce and TSH starts rising. And under the influence of TSH, finally the gland will recover and the patients become normal. And depending upon at what particular point in time you have evaluated the patient, T3, T4 can be high and TSH can be low. But in the middle of the natural history, T3, T4 can be normal, TSH on higher side. If you evaluate further across, TSH can be high and T3, T4 are normal. So often these patients are improperly labeled as subclinical hypothyroidism or subclinical hyperthyroidism, and unnecessarily they are started on antithyroid drugs or thyroxine supplementation. But in many of these conditions, most of the times the patients will recover on their own over a period of 3 to 4 months, and nothing needs to be done. So the causes of low uptake thyrotoxicosis are broadly categorized as leakage thyrotoxicosis. As I told, subacute or recurrence thyroiditis. The recurrence thyroiditis nowadays is very less frequently seen, where there is a classical neck pain or difficulty in swallowing and other such conditions, because patients have access for over-the-counter drugs, and as soon as they get some pain, there is a tendency to take paracetamol or NSAIDs. So we don't often see classical decurvence thyroiditis. Most of the times it is clinically silent. Autoimmune thyroiditis is another condition where because of elevated anti-TPO or anti-TG antibodies, there is destruction of the gland. And postpartum thyroiditis, typically 3 to 4 months after delivery, patients can have symptoms of thyrotoxicosis, weight loss, and sometimes there is a postpartum psychosis can also be a presentation, which is rare though. But in such conditions, again, the uptake is reduced in the gland, and usually nothing needs to be done. Factitious thyrotoxicosis is a condition where patients would have taken thyroxine supplementation on their own. Many a times for weight loss or something, they would Google or they will take thyroxine supplementation. In such conditions, again, T3, T4 are elevated and TSH is suppressed, and the gland will not show uptake. Another important reason for low uptake thyrotoxicosis is excess iodine supplementation. Most commonly nowadays because of post contrast studies, either contrast CT scan or IBP or cardiac angiograms. There is a iodinated contrast is administered, and because of excess iodine, there is something called as Jod-Basedow phenomenon. So the excess iodine will inhibit uptake of further tracer, and it also initially causes increased destruction of the gland and release of stored hormones. Amiodarone is another important condition for thyrotoxicosis. So it is very important to understand this phenomenon and this condition, because quite frequently we see low uptake thyrotoxicosis or leakage thyrotoxicosis in clinical practice. As far as management of these conditions is considered, most of the times there is a spontaneous recovery, especially non-autoimmune viral thyroiditis cases. Most of the times they will recover to euthyroid state within 3 to 4 months. All you will have to do is just assurance, give supportive measures like NSAIDs, fruit juices, beta blockers. If the patient is very toxic, we can give beta blockers, and if the sometimes there is a significant neck pain, in such cases you can give steroids. There is no role for antithyroid drugs, there is no role for radioiodine, or there is no role for surgery in such cases. High clinical suspicion is very important, and proper referral for a nuclear medicine diagnostic center is also very important in diagnosing these conditions. Many a times in autoimmune thyroiditis, there is sometimes recurrent chances of leakage thyrotoxicosis. So these patients need constant evaluation every 6 months or every yearly with the thyroid hormone profile. Whereas high uptake thyrotoxicosis, the most common cause is Graves' disease, where I have already told, the gland is uniformly increased in size with the diffuse increased uptake, the background activity is reduced. In such cases, the treatment plan and the natural history is different. Another important condition is toxic multinodal goiter, which again nowadays is less common, because it used to happen in earlier days where there is a long-standing goiter with and over a period of time, one or more than one nodules will decide to become autonomous, and the patients would become toxic. Another important cause is autonomous functioning thyroid nodule. There is a solitary nodule which shows increased uptake of the radio tracer. Rest of the gland shows relatively reduced or sometimes no uptake at all. Very rarely, high uptake thyrotoxicosis can be because of a pituitary tumor, but in such cases, TSH is also raised. Along with T3, T4, TSH is also raised. So this is important cue you have to look at in every patient with thyrotoxicosis. Another less common cause is tumors of placental origin, choriocarcinoma, which secrete excess human chorionic gonadotropin, which has a TSH mimicking effect that can also cause high uptake thyrotoxicosis. The management of high uptake thyrotoxicosis is different. As I said, they need a definitive management for a longer time, and initially we start with anti-thyroid drugs like propylthiouracil or thionamides, carbimazole or methimazole for 6 months to 1 year. If it does not resolve within 6 months to 1 year, then more definitive treatments. Earlier days, people used to do surgery, but nowadays radioiodine treatment, radioiodine therapy is the most important treatment in high uptake thyrotoxicosis, and surgery is restricted only in multinodular goiter or a huge goiter with compression symptoms, or whenever there is a suspicion of malignancy. And usually surgery is performed either hemithyroidectomy or subtotal thyroidectomy. But if there is a malignancy risk, then total thyroidectomy is needed. So now radioiodine therapy is the most important treatment in high uptake thyrotoxicosis. So how it acts is, iodine 131 is a radiotracer with a half-life of around 8 days. It emits 364 keV gamma rays and also emits 0.66 megavolt beta rays. It emits beta rays of different energy, but this is the most abundant or most important beta rays. And tissue destruction happens because of beta radiation, and the effect appears after weeks or months. It has a very short path length, and therefore there is no effect on adjacent structure except for the thyroid follicle. Even the parathyroid gland or carotid sheath and skin or no other organs are affected by radioiodine therapy. And who are all the candidates for radioiodine therapy? Earlier, it was thought that people of reproductive age group or younger children were not candidates, but nowadays we have almost more than 50 years data for safety of radioiodine therapy, and age and gender are no longer an issue for radioiodine therapy. And it can be used as primary treatment as well as after failure of other treatments, and repeated administration can also be done, but it is needed only in few cases. So what dose to administer? There are two types, either a fixed low dose therapy or fixed high dose therapy, or calculated dose based on gland size or uptake value, or this is called as dosimetric approach, but this is cumbersome and usually nobody follows it. Most of the places we follow either a fixed low dose or fixed high dose therapy. And if the dose of radioiodine administered is usually 5 to 8 millicurie, if Graves' disease is a smaller gland with recent onset and high uptake, and 10 to 15 millicurie is most commonly used dose. And also for autonomous functioning thyroid nodules or large gland, and even in children, we use more than 10 to 15 millicuries. And a large autonomous functioning thyroid nodule or toxic multinodular goiter after FNAC, and after ensuring that there is no malignancy, or if the patient is not a candidate for surgery, we use more than 15 millicurie. A second treatment may be needed, but we usually wait for 6 to 9 months before going ahead with the second treatment. And it can be repeated more than 2 times also, but which is very rare. There is a condition called as very rapid turnover of glands, where the gland is hyperactive, hypervascular, and there is a rapid uptake and rapid washout. Only in such conditions, more than one treatment may be needed. Efficacy of the treatment, in most of the cases, success is seen within 3 to 6 months, and after 5 millicurie, and most of the patients will become hypothyroid after 3 to 6 months. When we administer 10 to 15 millicurie, most of the patients, almost 70 to 80% becomes hypothyroid within 1 year. Precautions after treatment. In India, less than 30 millicurie, we don't need admission of the patients, and it is done as an outpatient procedure. But the patients have to follow personal and cloth hygiene for 2 to 3 weeks, and also avoid close contact with people pregnant women and children for 1 to 2 weeks, and pregnancy has to be deferred for at least 1 year. Again, this is not because of any worry about risk of mutation or gonadal radiation dose, but most of the times the hormone profile to become normal will take 6 to 9 months, because initially they may become hypothyroid, then we start them on thyroxine, then again they will take 2 to 3 months for becoming euthyroid, or sometimes dose titration is needed. So it is better to wait for 9 to 12 months before planning pregnancy. Nowadays, if somebody is planning pregnancy, most of the even endocrinologists refer a Graves disease or high uptake thyrotoxicosis patient for radioiodine therapy upfront, because managing rendering the patient hypothyroid and managing hypothyroidism during pregnancy is easier than managing hyperthyroidism during pregnancy, because there is a risk of thyrotoxic crisis or thyroid storm, abortion, early delivery, and such conditions. Therefore, even in reproductive, women with reproductive age group, we are nowadays managing them with radioiodine. And side effects and complications are less frequent. Acute radiation thyroiditis is rare. Usually, it is mild and self-limiting and can be controlled with NSAIDs, and rarely with may need steroids. Thyroid storm again is rare. Usually, it can happen 1 to 2 weeks after radioiodine therapy, and it is common in more common in older patients and severe disease. In such cases, we pre-treat them with antithyroid drugs, try to render them euthyroid, and then give radioiodine therapy. And adequate beta blockage is needed in most of the patients after radioiodine therapy for 4 to 6 weeks. Long-term risks of increased thyroid cancer or decreased fertility or mutations is only of theoretical concern. And nowadays we have data, established published data of more than 50 years that radioiodine therapy is safe even in most of the patients. Antithyroid drugs and radioiodine treatment. Antithyroid drugs in a week before iodine 131 will reduce efficacy of the treatment, because antithyroid drugs, most of them act by inhibiting organification of iodine, whether natural iodine or radioactive iodine. So we prefer to stop antithyroid drugs at least 5 days before radioiodine treatment. And after iodine treatment, antithyroid drugs are again not needed in most of the patients. Most of the patients we manage with the beta blockers, and 6 to 8 weeks after radioiodine therapy, we again evaluate them with thyroid hormone profile, and only in some cases antithyroid drugs are prescribed after radioactive iodine treatment. So radioiodine and eye disease. Again, earlier days orbitopathy was considered as a contraindication for Graves disease. But what we have to understand is orbitopathy is a part of syndrome complex of Graves disease, and the natural history of orbitopathy is independent of thyroidopathy. So basically, Graves disease is a condition with a syndrome complex of orbitopathy, dermopathy, and thyroid problem. And orbitopathy can precede or occur together or follow radioiodine thyrotoxicosis presentation. So whether to treat these patients with radioiodine or not, we usually follow this clinical activity score, like pain in primary gaze, pain in eye movements, redness of the eyeball, eyelid swelling, eyelid erythema, or conjunctival redness, caruncular swelling and redness, and visual acuity and increased diplopia. We can take a consultation with an ophthalmologist and then decide whether to treat them with radioiodine or antithyroid drugs or surgery. Smoking is definitely a high risk factor for orbitopathy. But most of the guidelines, American Thyroid Association guidelines and European guidelines, you can see in most of the patients in the mild active orbitopathy, iodine 131 and antithyroid drugs or surgery should be considered as equally acceptable therapeutic options. Even with mild active orbitopathy with no other risk factors, they are equally treatment of equal importance, and we can club them with corticosteroids if needed to reduce the orbitopathy symptoms. Only if there is a site-threatening orbitopathy, radioiodine is contraindicated. In such cases, antithyroid drugs and surgery is preferable. Again, in inactive ophthalmopathy, like usually orbitopathy has an initial rapid deteriorating course or worsening course over a period of 6 months to 1.5 years, and then it plateaus or it becomes inactive. So in inactive orbitopathy also, radioiodine treatment with or without corticosteroids is equally acceptable therapeutic option. And now coming to special situations like in children, managing children with drugs is difficult because compliance is an issue. Administration, you have to powder them and make sweet concoctions, and so many other practical problems are there. And the long-term adherence to the treatment is also difficult. And surgery is technically more difficult, and there are very few thyroid surgeons who can do thyroidectomy in children. Therefore, even in children, most of the societies, American or European thyroid associations, they recommend radioiodine treatment as the treatment of choice. But we will wait up to 5 years. After 5 years, radioiodine treatment is the treatment of choice. And you may be wondering, do we see in less than 5 years? Yeah, we can see Graves' disease even in children. I have seen one high uptake thyrotoxicose in a small baby of around 8 months. And I have seen in another small child of 2 years and 3 years. Though they are rare, but we can see even in such patients, such young age. But iodine 131 is administered after 5 years. And in children, we usually want to blast the gland. So we usually give a fixed high dose 15 millicurie of iodine for to ensure that the gland is completely destroyed. That is because we don't want to leave behind any tissue in the neck, because as you know, irradiated thyroid gland is at risk for thyroid cancer later. It is a theoretical concern, but we want to make sure that there is no residual thyroid tissue. In pregnancy is another important condition. In pregnancy, diagnosis is also often difficult. So most of the places there is a bioassay called as TSH receptor antibody bioassay. It is also called as TRAB assay. But the disadvantage of TRAB assay is it cannot differentiate between stimulatory and inhibitory antibodies, and it is not available, and it is quite costly. In Bangalore, it costs around 13 to 15,000 rupees, and usually the results are available after 1 week. So for that reason, even in pregnancy, we can do a technetium pertechnetate scan. See, in pregnancy, we will administer lesser dosage of technetium than in a normal patient, and patient has to take plenty of fluids and water so that extra pertechnetate is washed out in urine. And there are many publications even in International Atomic Energy Agency also, it says technetium pertechnetate scan can be considered in for a quick differentiation between low uptake and high uptake thyrotoxicosis even in pregnancy. Both the whole body radiation dose to the patient as well as the fetus is very less. The radiation dose from pertechnetate scan is almost equal to or even less than a chest X-ray. So safety is established, and in fact, beta blockers and antithyroid drugs are also not safe. So you have to bear that in mind. But one thing is, unless referring physician, referring gynecologist, referring endocrinologist has primed the patient that it is safe, it becomes very difficult for a nuclear medicine physician to do the scan. So we consider pregnancy is a absolute contraindication, but in special situations with the consent of referring physician and the patient, we can do thyroid scan. But iodine 131 is contraindicated. We have to do only technetium pertechnetate. And as I said, drugs can also have serious side effects like aplasia cutis or coronal atresia or hepatotoxicity or bone marrow suppression, agranulocytosis, and other such things. So it is very important to differentiate between the high uptake and low uptake thyrotoxicosis in pregnancy. But during pregnancy, the management is with propylthiouracil in first trimester and switch over to anti-carbimazole or methimazole in second trimester. And surgery can be done in second trimester. Careful fetal monitoring is must. In CRF again, iodine 131 can be administered. Dose need not be adjusted, but only dialysis is recommended after iodine 131 therapy, and dialysis the equipments have to be either stored or disposed of carefully after ensuring decay, and usually they are stored for 6 to 8 weeks before disposal, and treatment in a private room is preferred, and attendants also we have to tell them to take extra precautions. Usually follow up after radiotherapy is at 1 month, and after 3 months we follow them clinically with or with the hormone profile. Serum TSH remains suppressed for long time after radiotherapy. This is very important to understand. So clinical improvement is more important in managing, taking further decisions. So because there is something called as inverse linear log relationship between TSH and T3 and T4 levels. TSH remains suppressed even after T3 and T4 are normalized. So you cannot call them as failure of radiodin treatment, or take a decision to start them on neometrazole or carbimazole immediately if TSH is reduced. You have to assess the patient clinically. If the patient is doing well, he has gained weight, and clinically if he feels better, you repeat hormone profile again after 4 to 6 weeks after the initial presentation, and then take a call whether to do a repeat thyroid scan, and we can ascertain whether the gland still shows high uptake or reduced uptake, and based on that we can take a call about further treatment. Transient hypothyroidism is also possible, where TSH is mildly elevated, or but T3 T4 are normal. Again, in such cases, no need to start them immediately on thyroxine. We can wait for another 4 to 6 weeks if the patient is not clinically frankly hypothyroid, and take accordingly to follow or start them on thyroxine. This is often we are asked about this question, whether there is an increased risk of thyroid cancer in Graves' disease after iodine 131 therapy, or a benign thyroid disorders after radiodione therapy. And there are several publications which say that the relative risk of thyroid cancer is minus 0.5 to plus 2 or 3. That means radiodione therapy can be has shown reduced thyroid cancer risk compared to anti-thyroid drugs or even surgery, versus in some cases there is increased risk. But over a period of time, people have studied more, and now they think any benign thyroid disorder patient are always at higher, naturally they are at a higher risk for thyroid cancer, and radioiodine per se does not have any incremental role. Most recent study is published just 2 months back in Thyroid, which is a very important journal, and they have followed almost 16,000 patients over a period of 15 years, and they have found, and their conclusion is there is no association between radiotherapy therapy for hypothyroidism and risk of increased thyroid cancer in long-term follow-up. Only in univariate analysis, they found some increased incidence of NHL. But here again, there is argument that autoimmune thyroid disorder itself is a increased risk factor for lymphoma, thyroid lymphomas, and how much additional risk factor is by radioiodine cannot be ascertained. Now, coming to thyroid nodule and thyroid cancer, in thyroid nodule, there is not much role for protected rate scan or nuclear imaging. So this is a standard algorithm. Any patient with a solitary or dominant nodule, you have to first evaluate with the thyroid function test. If TSH is suppressed, then you recommend a scintigraphy. If the palpable nodule is hot, then radiation treatment or medical surveillance is needed. If the palpable nodule is cold, FNAC is needed. And subsequent to FNAC, whether it is benign or malignant or indeterminate, if it is benign, stop or close follow-up is needed. If it is malignant, no doubt you have to do surgery. And in indeterminate cases, you have to follow more frequently. In the initial evaluation, if TFTs are normal, again FNAC is the first investigation, then scintigraphy, and again based on FNAC findings, further treatment is decided. And results of nuclear scan is either it can be a hot or euthyroid or cold nodules. Both this is called as warm nodule. Both warm and cold nodules are together. They are grouped and they are considered at higher risk for thyroid cancer. But we have to bear in mind it is only around 5 to 10%. Only 5 to 10% of cold or warm nodules are thyroid cancer. But most of the other nodules are benign colloid goiter or something. Benign conditions are seen, but most of the cancers are cold, but not all cold nodules are cancer. This we have to bear in mind. Now coming to thyroid cancer, the role of nuclear medicine physician is after surgery. So I will not go into details about type of surgery and other things which you will know better. So our role is after surgery, in case of differentiated thyroid cancer, we have to evaluate and treat them. So why iodine 131 scan and treatment? So that is to ablate the residual tissue, and there are many publications. This is the most important publications in a retrospective analysis of 1600 patients. Iodine 131 was considered as the most powerful indicator of disease-free survival. See, thyroid cancer is one relatively good cancer where it will not kill the patient, but it is at high risk of recurrence, either local recurrence or systemic recurrence. Therefore, radioiodine treatment will significantly reduce the risk of recurrence. So, the publications say if the patients comparably at the similar risk patients, if they are treated or non-treated with radioiodine therapy, the risk of recurrence is almost 30% in 10 years without radioiodine treatment, and it is less than 1% if they are treated with radioiodine therapy. So the most important reason is to ablate the residual tissue and kill any microscopic foci of tumor cells anywhere else, and also use thyroglobulin assay as a tumor marker in subsequent follow-ups. If there is a small amount of thyroid tissue left, then what happens is it will itself produce thyroglobulin, and the bioassay becomes less specific and less sensitive. So if you destroy the remnant tissue completely, you can follow the patients with thyroglobulin assay. If thyroglobulin starts increasing, we can evaluate these patients more aggressively and treat accordingly. So iodine 131 scan is usually done 4 to 6 weeks after surgery, and before surgery, earlier it was considered that contrast CT scan is a contraindication, but nowadays contrast CT is done with non-ionized contrast, which is cleared out of the body faster than ionized iodine. So you can do a even you can do a contrast CT before surgery to plan more accurate surgery. And what is important is we usually do iodine 131 scan 3 to 6 weeks after surgery, and during this period you have to ensure iodine free diet. Most of the dairy, iodized salt, iodex, or any iodine containing multivitamins or other such substances have to be avoided, and no thyroid replacement for 3 to 6 weeks. But nowadays, if the patients can afford, we can treat them, we can start them on thyroxine, but we can give an option of recombinant TSH. One disadvantage of recombinant TSH is it is very costly. In India, it costs around 95 to 98,000 rupees. And usually it is given on day 1 and day 2, and on day 3 we will plan a diagnostic scan and immediately follow with the therapy also. So what are the normal findings of a iodine 131 scan? See, all nuclear medicine scans, unlike CT, don't come with a good structural information. So unless you have seen at least on 20 to 30 scans, you may not be able to make out what is what. So this is a normal iodine 131 scan. This is a whole body silho you can make out. This is normal salivary glands and excreted activity in gut, and also some amount of stomach activity will be there, and excreted activity in urinary bladder will be there, and this is background activity. So here is, this is the head, this is neck, this is body, and this is abdomen, pelvis, and lower limbs. So this is a normal scan. Here is another patient. You can see there is abnormal tracer accumulation in the neck. It is the residual tissue after surgery, and there is also another uptake in lower down in the neck. It could be a superior mediastinal node. It could be a sternal metastasis. So nowadays, or it could be a vertebral metastasis also. Nowadays, most of the centers will have SPECT CT or a different CT. In such cases, what we do is we take a separate CT scan of this region and we fuse it with nuclear medicine SPECT images, and we can make out whether this tissue is a lymph node or sternal lesion or vertebral lesion. So this patient had a significant remnant tissue and a superior mediastinal node. So this is another important reason why we do radioiodine scan after surgery, because pre-operative imaging can miss a small level 6 nodes or level 7 nodes or mediastinal nodes, whereas a whole body scan will pick up such cases and it helps in deciding further treatment. So this was another patient. There was a faint uptake in the neck, but there was an abnormal uptake in lower down in the trunk. So it was seen better in a posterior image. And further, we took a CT scan of this region, and it was found to be an adrenal nodule. So nowadays, nuclear medicine is we are merging the functional information from nuclear medicine with the structural information of radiology, like CT scan, and we get very good information which is good for patient management. Now radioiodine treatment after surgery, we decide based on whole body scan and thyroglobulin and clinical risk criteria, like that is ages or AMS criteria, age, gender, extent of the disease, metastasis, and all these conditions we decide in which category patient falls, and also based on scan findings we decide whether to give low dose or high dose therapy. Usually the dose administered is for remnant ablation. We give around 30 to 50 millicurie of radioiodine. For lymph nodal metastasis, around 75 to 100 millicurie. In case of lung metastasis, 150 millicurie. And in case of skeletal and visceral metastasis, 200 to 250 millicurie. In case of lymph node metastasis, all palpable lymph nodes, it is always good to do surgery, neck dissection. Only if the nodes are not palpable, either upfront or in the follow-up, we give radioiodine treatment. And in such cases, repeated treatments may be needed. Lung metastasis again are common in young patients or children. And again, in such cases, repeated treatments are needed. Skeletal and visceral metastasis again, most of the times need repeated treatment. And we can go up to a cumulative dose of around 1 to 1.5 curie. That is almost 10 to 10 times we can give radioiodine therapy over a period, over an interval of 6 to 9 months. And after 1.5 curie, we assess the patient with for bone marrow toxicity and pulmonary function test. And sometimes we can go even up to 2 curies also. But nowadays, skeletal metastasis is less common, and now we have got some more medical drugs in our armamentarium also. Few images. This was a patient. You can see these serial static images. All these dark spots are abnormal findings. There was significant remnant, multiple lymph nodes also. There was some bone lesions in the sacrum and the pelvic bones, and in some of the vertebrae also. This patient, after 2 doses of 2 doses of treatment, there is significant resolution of most of the lesions, and his thyroglobulin was also less than 1 nanograms per ml. So we say a patient has no evidence of disease provided iodine 131 scan is negative. There are no palpable clinical nodes. Serum thyroglobulin is less than 2 nanogram per ml, and clinically or scan wise there is no other lesions. And follow-up is usually we follow initially at 6 months interval with iodine 131 scan, thyroglobulin, anti-thyroglobulin antibodies. And say this is important. Anti-thyroglobulin antibodies is also very important, because if anti-thyroglobulin antibodies are very high, it interferes with thyroglobulin assay, and often we find false negative thyroglobulin levels. So, and increased antithyroglobulin levels in a patient with baseline normal ATG itself is an indicator of disease recurrence also, and these patients also have to be followed more aggressively. And once a patient scan has become negative, we usually follow them yearly on thyroxine with thyroglobulin TSH, and 3 or 5 yearly intervals, we stop thyroxine tablets and do a whole body scan, or you can offer recombinant TSH also for such patients. And few other emerging trends in lobar ablation or after hemithyroidectomy. Sometimes the patients, now we have got almost more than 20-year data from different centers that we can do a lobar ablation. Basically because upfront there was a thyroid nodule and FNAC was not conclusive, and only hemithyroidectomy was done because other risk factors were there. But after histopathology, it turned out to be malignant. Now, to do whether to do completion thyroidectomy or whether to do lobar ablation, even though we have a data of more than 20 years that lobar ablation is equally effective, but currently lobar ablation is restricted only if the patient is reluctant or if the surgeon is reluctant to do second surgery. For example, upfront there might be a parathyroid gland injury or recurrent laryngeal nerve injury, or there might have been a lot of adhesions because of thyroiditis, coexistent autoimmune thyroiditis, where the surgeon thinks second surgery is more difficult. In such patients, we can confidently do lobar ablation. One disadvantage is they may need more than one or more than 2 sittings for complete ablation. Neoadjuvant iodine-131 therapy is a novel idea, and it can be done in inoperable primary tumors. For example, highly vascular large tumors, it could have invaded, or there is a doubt of involvement of carotid sheath or prevertebral tissues, and surgery might be very difficult, or there might be a mediastinal extension or intrathoracic thyroid. In such conditions, definitely one can consider iodine-131 therapy. Iodine-131 definitely reduces the size of the gland and reduces the vascularity, and later you can consider a safe surgery. So just like in other malignancies, where inoperable primary upfront advanced malignancies, neoadjuvant chemotherapy is given, here we can give neoadjuvant radionuclide therapy. And TENIS is a condition which we usually encounter in the follow-up of patients where thyroglobulin is elevated, but iodine-131 scan is negative. So this is a marker of dedifferentiation or more aggressive tumors. In such cases, we can consider FDG PET-CT to detect any operable lesions are there in the body. It could be a lymph node or it could be a solitary metastasis, and nowadays there is a concept of oligometastasis and operation surgery for oligometastasis. So we can do an FDG PET-CT, and if FDG PET-CT is positive, if there are operable lesions, you can do an operable surgery. But if FDG PET-CT is also negative, you can do one or at least one sitting of empirical radioiodine therapy. And if post-therapy scan does not show any lesions, then we take them for redifferentiation therapy, or nowadays we have some more drugs called as tyrosine kinase inhibitors or multi-kinase inhibitors. So this goes more in a medical oncologist's code rather than a nuclear medicine physician's code. But as I said, nowadays management of differentiated thyroid cancer is becoming a multidisciplinary approach where ENT surgeons, head and neck surgeons, and nuclear medicine physicians, endocrinologists, and medical oncologists, all of them may have to sit together and decide what is the suitable treatment for the patient and act accordingly. So before I finish, one barrier everybody has is nuclear medicine is dangerous. It has associated with high radiation and such. There are some myths and some misunderstandings. I want to clear some of them. So, nuclear medicine in general has associated with less radiation dose than conventional radiology like CT or angiogram. And radiation risks are usually based on stochastic, linear, no threshold model. And there is no evidence that it is harmful to patient or attendants at the doses what we administer, either for imaging or for therapy. And as imaging and as diagnostic workup is becoming more frequent, nowadays we have data also that at the doses administered, nuclear medicine is quite a safe procedure. And if you compare it with other risks associated with other events in life like smoking or traveling or eating food, and nowadays with coronavirus practically everything is they are at risk. So compared to all those things, nuclear medicine is quite safe and procedure. So that mental barrier has to first go out of doctor's mindset, and then you can convince the patients, and it becomes easier for us nuclear medicine physicians also in treating these patients. Thank you. If there are any doubts, you are,
Yeah, there are several doubts, Dr. Murali. First of all, I congratulate you for that wonderful speech. We had about 265 participants from 22 countries. That's really,
that's great.
yeah, that's really
That is great.
Yeah. See,
Yes,
some participants, they arrived late, particularly my guru, Dr. Ananda Brata Bose.
Okay,
He's
sir.
from Siliguri.
Yes.
Can you repeat that first case? Can you quickly go back presentation? Just the first case. Then after that, we'll go through the questions.
Yes, sir. This one, sir?
Yeah. Just.
Okay. So this was a patient with long-standing mild goiter. So she, after she had this goiter, she is a villager. You can make out with whatever this you can see. She had this goiter for almost 5 to 6 years. Then she presented with weight loss, fatigue, anxiety, and palpitations since 1 month. And the clinical diagnosis was toxic multinodular goiter because ultrasound revealed multiple hypoechoic nodules, and it was considered as toxic multinodular goiter. But on a scan, you can see there was no uptake. So I have seen many such cases where there is a long-standing goiter with the patient becomes toxic in between. So this is because superimposed thyroiditis in such on a existing goiter also. So either it can be viral or autoimmune pathology developing in a patient because of fluctuations in the body of the antibodies or superimposed viral infections. There is cross-reacting antibodies which act against the gland, and they become they destroy the gland, and there is a release of hormones, and they become toxic. So there is no need to hurry either for antithyroid drugs or for surgery in such patients. So it is always good you evaluate with a nuclear scan. If the nuclear scan shows reduced uptake, so you can wait and watch for another 2 or 3 months and follow these patients clinically and see whether they are becoming worse or they are improving. If they are improving, no need to do anything. Another important factor you have to bear in mind is in an active inflammatory setting, even FNAC is not reliable, or FNAC is painful, and surgery is also not indicated. So in such cases, you have to better you follow them for some period, see whether they become euthyroid, and then evaluate with a repeat ultrasound scan, repeat nuclear scan, and or a repeat FNAC.
Okay. So there's one question, Dr. Mandik Kumar from ISO is asking, see, many patients with hyperthyroidism, they come without any thyromegaly.
Yes, sir.
We have to do thyroid scintigraphy.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. See, nowadays, because of increased mast health checkup facilities, where often we encounter such patients where TSH is low. A patient can be mildly toxic or asymptomatic, or he will give vague symptoms, some fatigability, some weight loss or hair loss, and such conditions. And clinically, there is no palpable goiter. And in most of such patients, this is the picture. There is no uptake in the gland in most of such patients.
Okay.
So if you start them on antithyroid drugs immediately, what happens is they will become hypothyroid, because you are interfering with the natural history of the thyroiditis. As I said, see, The patient might have presented somewhere here. TSH is
Okay.
low. T3, T4 can be high or it can be normal also. And if
Okay.
you give antithyroid drugs, the TSH elevation and stimulation of the gland and recovery process becomes interfere, and they become quickly hypothyroid, and then they are started on 25 microgram thyroxine supplementation. So this
Oh,
often we
yeah.
see this 25 microgram thyroxine supplementation in most of these patients. This should have been the case. So
Okay.
the
Okay. Okay. And next question: why advise iodine restricted diet following surgery? Which patient they have not mentioned? Patient is asked to wait until HP report. Why? They are not mentioned which condition, in which condition.
after surgery means I think thyroid cancer ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, after surgery, because see, radioactive iodine is nothing but a isotope of iodine. Iodine has around 17 isotopes. The stable isotope, stable iodine is essentially essential for body, and we use it with universal iodization of the salt becoming standard. Uh, the radio that will interfere with radioactive iodine uptake by the tissues.
Okay.
Therefore,
Okay.
we want to restrict iodine after surgery.
Okay. So, what is the role of oral iodine therapy for thyrotoxicosis? Is there a role?
Lugol's iodine, you mean cold iodine? Lugol's
Yeah,
iodine or
I think so. Yes, yes.
okay. No, earlier days Lugol's iodine was given. Usually it was given before surgery to reduce the vascularity of the gland, and to reduce even with the idea that it will render the patient euthyroid. See, but the problem is Lugol's iodine acts only if you understand the iodine uptake mechanism. I showed you Jod-Basedow phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
So there is something called as auto-regulation. So what happens is thyroid gland, every step of iodine uptake and thyroid hormone synthesis is very strictly auto-regulated. For example, there is a TSH from pituitary, TRH from hypothyroid, TSH from pituitary, sorry, TRH from hypothalamus, TSH from pituitary, and sodium iodide importer. All these act in a same axis. Whenever you give excess iodine, sodium iodide expression, sodium iodide importer expression is reduced. So iodine uptake is reduced. Then excess iodine also acts on thyroid peroxidase enzyme, and it inhibits the activity of thyroid peroxidase enzyme, and also it inhibits iodization of thyroglobulin, reuptake of thyroglobulin, and every step. But this is only a transient phenomenon. If you give iodine, excess iodine for some time and then stop, there is something called as escape from Jod-Basedow phenomenon. So again, patient becomes toxic. So the effect of Lugol's iodine or potassium iodide solution is only transient. So earlier also it was usually restricted before surgery.
Okay. Yeah. How do you manage your autonomous thyroid nodule? That you have covered it.
Yes, sir.
I think you have covered that. You showed that chart.
Yeah. Autonomous
okay.
functioning thyroid nodule. Earlier we used to do only technetium scan, and if the uptake was high, we used to give radioiodine therapy. But nowadays, the incidence of thyroid cancer is increasing, and we are seeing, even in a hot nodule, we are seeing a malignancy. So in always, even in such cases, we do a FNAC, ensure that there is no malignancy, and we then go ahead with radioiodine therapy.
Okay.
And another thing is, if there is a big cold nodule within the autonomous functioning thyroid nodule, usually it is because of colloid degeneration, but we don't want to take a risk, and in such cases, we usually do hemithyroidectomy, frozen section, and then proceed.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. See, following radioiodine therapy,
yes, sir.
This hypothyroidism, whether it's permanent or just temporary?
Usually it is permanent, sir.
Permanent,
Most of the times it is. See, nowadays patients don't accept this low dose 5 millicurie therapy. So if you see earlier in a small gland, we used to give 5 millicurie. With 5 millicurie, there is a good chance of euthyroid state being achieved in almost 25 to 30% of patients. But there is also a risk of retreatment in 25% of the patients.
Okay. Okay.
So if the patient is ready for retreatment, then we can give the first treatment can be 5 to 6 millicurie, and we can try to achieve euthyroid status. But even in that patient, euthyroid status is can last 2 to 5 years. Again, finally, eventually they become hypothyroid.
Okay. See, at what size of residual tissue can be ablated completely with radiodiene ablative therapy? Is there any size like that?
No, usually see, there are some studies. In fact, my dissertation was also on the same thing, where the patients, I have measured the remnant tissue size after total thyroidectomy or near total thyroidectomy and hemithyroidectomy. Hemithyroidectomy, we know there is definitely a significant issue, but total thyroidectomy and near total thyroidectomy, sometimes surgeries may be complicated. Unexpectedly, you may find it may be adherent to trachea, esophagus, or adjacent tissues, or recurrent laryngeal nerve traversing across the tissue. So in such cases, you can confidently leave behind some tissue. And my thesis, I found out that if the remnant tissue is 6 to 7 grams, with single dose, we can achieve a complete ablation in almost 90 to 95% of the patients. If it is more than 6 grams tissue, they may need 2 doses. Yeah.
See, because of the lockdown, are those isotopes available right now? Iodine isotopes?
No, sir. Right now, iodine is not.
So how are you managing those patients? How are you
For
managing?
the say, usually thyroid cancer, we can confidently postpone the surgery
Okay.
unless it is T3 or T4. T1, T2 surgeries can be postponed. So that's what we were telling, and even the surgeons have been following in most of the places. T1, T2 surgeries they are postponing. T3, T4 or N cases they are operating, but they are starting them on thyroxine, and we are hopeful that iodine 131 supply may resume maybe from next week or after 10-15 days. Then we will tell the patients to stop thyroxine or give them the option of recombinant TSH and do treatment.
Okay. So what is your practice protocol for adjuvant therapy in thyroid cancer with low ATA risk? Like if it is low risk, what is your dose? High risk, intermediate risk?
Sir, as I said, in all cases, we in low risk category, we do an iodine 131 scan. If the surgeon says it is total thyroidectomy, we go ahead and do an iodine 131 scan. And I told sometimes unexpectedly we find superior mediastinal nodes or level 7 nodes, which is away from the thyroid remnant tissue. So in such cases, we go ahead and we do give treatment. If it is a clinically low risk, less than 1 centimeter, no other risk factors, and iodine 131 scan is negative, then we just follow them conservatively.
Okay. Are there any situations when you give large dose scans, advise large dose scans?
Large dose scans means, see, after radiation therapy, after surgery, whatever we do, the scan is called as low dose scan. Some people call that itself as a large dose scan. See, iodine 131 for thyroid uptake is administered less dose. It is around 25 to 50 microcurie. For scan, we give 1.5 to 3 millicuries. So that is so some people used to call this diagnostic iodine 131 scan itself as a large dose scan. But most of the places, large dose scan means post therapy scan. For example, thyroid cancer, after we have given 50 to 75 millicurie or whatever radioiodine therapy, again we do another post therapy scan 3 to 7 days after treatment, because sometimes we can find a discrepancy. The initial scan can be negative, but post therapy scan picks up some additional lesions. It is usually, but only in 5% of the patients we can pick additional lesions, but in most of the patients we do follow all patients with post therapy scan.
Okay. So probably a junior colleague has asked, in your terminology, what is a hot and cold nodule?
Hot nodule is one nodule which takes up more tracer compared to rest of the gland. Cold nodule is one which takes up less uptake compared to rest of the gland.
Okay.
See, here you can make out. See, this is a hot nodule. The rest of the gland is reduced uptake. So this is again, there are multiple dominant nodules. These dark spots are hot nodules. These relatively white spots are cold nodules.
Okay. But the timing of RI after surgery for well-differentiated thyroid cancer?
Usually 3 to 6 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks after surgery.
3 to
We
4
want
weeks.
TSH to rise at least to 30, preferably above 50. But the guidelines say you have to wait at least till the TSH becomes 30.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, looks like not the questions. Role of I-131 after total thyroidectomy in CA case. I think you have covered that already.
Yeah, covered.
Yeah. Okay, how long we can wait in long-standing hyperthyroidism for iodine therapy? How long you can wait?
How long means long-standing?
Hyperthyroid, last term Graves' disease. How long we can wait? Patient can wait. I mean, how long he can be an antithyroid
Before
medicine?
radiation therapy. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, see, the recommended this one is you wait for 1 to 1.5 years after starting antithyroid drugs. If the patient does not become euthyroid within that interval, better to give radioiodine therapy. In long-standing Graves' disease patient, that means those patients who are on one or high-dose antithyroid drugs but still not achieved euthyroid status, then definitely you have to take them for as early as possible.
Okay. So now that thyroid isotope is not available, there is no alternative. How long we can wait? This patient wait?
Radioiodine thyroid surgeries, sir, you can wait even 3 to 6 months. Also, you can wait. See, after surgery, you start them on suppressive thyroxine therapy. That means you try to keep TSH around 0.1 or less than 0.1. So, suppressed TSH itself will inhibit growth of any tissue, and you can wait. Hopefully, it will improve in another 1 week or 15 days.
Okay, how metastatic nodules appear in scan while thyroid scan it is cold nodules?
See, metastasis, usually what happens is the cancerous tissue has less radioiodine uptake compared to normal tissue. So that is why it appears cold in an intact thyroid gland.
Okay.
So it doesn't mean that there is no uptake in that particular nodule. See, this will also have some amount of radioiodine uptake. But in the presence of normal tissue, this uptake is less compared to rest of the gland. Therefore, it appears cold. But a metastatic setting, what happens is you have removed the intact thyroid by doing total thyroidectomy. So that is why total thyroidectomy is done. Even in a case of metastatic differentiated thyroid cancer, for example, a patient might have presented with vertebral metastasis or lung metastasis or liver metastasis upfront. So even in such cases, unlike other solid organ malignancies, it is recommended to do thyroidectomy. So once you do total thyroidectomy and once you allow TSH to rise, under the influence of TSH, all those metastatic tissues will start taking up more iodine, and that we can pick up.
See, many places the surgeries are being done just based on USG and FNAC, not a radio scan. Is it a safe practice?
Upfront, sir, thyroid cancer? You mean in a
general thyroid surgery?
General thyroid surgery, nuclear scan is not needed for malignancy. See, nowadays we have got very good ultrasound scanners available, and there is something called as thyroid scaling also. Just like in breast cancer, we have BIRAD scaling. So in thyroid cancer, thyroid nodules, there is something called as thyroid TIRAD risk categorization. Whereas where thyroid 1 to 2 scoring is considered benign, you can follow them conservatively. Thyroid 3 is equivocal, you have to follow them more closely. Whereas thyroid 4 and 5 are definitely malignant, and surgery is definitely needed irrespective of FNAC result. So FNAC in thyroid nodule has one disadvantage, even though literature says 80 to 90% sensitivity, but in practice it is only 40 to 50% sensitivity, because it is fed with lot of sampling errors, and also expertise of the pathologist is also very important. Routine pathologist versus a cytopathologist itself, there is a lot of learning curve.
Do patients who receive radiodiode therapy have lot of burning sensation of skin?
Nothing,
Nothing. No.
nothing,
It's
nothing.
not that.
So
Okay.
usually it is one of the safest treatments available in medical practice. So at the most, some people have gastritis. So nowadays, 3 days antihistaminics or PPIs are enough to take care of that also. Very few patients can have nausea, vomiting. That is also can be managed with domperidone or rarely Amiset. Rarely patients will require IV administration of Amiset or ondansetron.
Yeah. Any difference between LDS and WBS?
No, LD scan means a whole body scan only.
Yeah, no difference, na?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. By default, it is whole body scan.
Yeah, this you covered, but still somebody has asked a question. What is the dose of iodine used for whole body iodine scan?
For whole body scan, 1.5 to 3 millicuries.
Okay.
And
another basic question, could you explain the relationship between TSH, T3, T4, inverse log linear relationship for the follow-up post-radio iodine administration?
Yeah. What it means is basically linear change in T3 or T4. For example, T4 is let us say 4 microgram per ml. If it becomes 5 microgram per ml, there is not much significant change in TSH level. If T4 changes from 5 to 16, TSH changes from 0.1 to 0.01.
Okay. See, how lung metastasis responds to this thing?
Most of lung metastasis do respond wonderfully. Especially in children and young adults, usually 2 or 3 sittings, almost 100% you can achieve complete cure. And even the thyroglobulin levels are also very less. But solid nodular lesions in older patients, like what we call cannonball lesions, they are little less responsive. And also high grade variants like insular variant or Hurthle cell variants, they are also relatively less sensitive. But in all patients, it is good to try at least with 1 dose radiodiode therapy. And based on post-therapy scan findings, if the post-therapy scan shows very good uptake, you can plan subsequent therapy also. If the post-therapy scan does not show good uptake, then you can consider this TKIs or multi-kinase inhibitors.
Okay. So what are chances of failure of radiodiode therapy for hypothyroidism patients? That's one thing. Then what next if radiodiode therapy is not working? So if at all we are planning for surgery, when are we going to do that?
Yeah. So radiodiode therapy failure rates are very, very, very less. Say unless you have given 5 low dose, like there is a big goiter, but you have given less dose. So that is one reason for failure. Another reason is if the patient is taking antithyroid drugs or on a high iodized supplement, iodized the cold iodine in the body because of contrast investigations, dietary supplements, multivitamins, and other things. That is another reason. But most of the Graves' disease do respond. Almost, I will say 99.9% patients will respond to radiodiode therapy.
Yeah.
So I have treated only 2 patients in last 15 years. I have given more than 4 treatments, but I have achieved cure even in them with 4 doses. So
yeah, somebody is still not able to follow it. I think they are requested to re-explain thyrotoxicosis and hyperthyroidism relationship, correlation.
Yeah. See, thyrotoxicosis is a constellation of symptoms because of excess hormones in the circulation. And these excess hormones in the circulation can be because of the thyroid gland itself is producing more hormones, either by Graves' disease, either by diffuse toxic goiter or multinodular goiter or autonomous functioning thyroid nodule. Whereas in other causes of excess hormones are these causes, these leakage thyrotoxicosis, where the gland is destroyed. See, usually the thyroid gland will have store hormones for almost 1 to 2 months. So whenever the gland is destroyed, all the stored hormones will get released into the circulation. It is like a dam which is broken and a flood situation has happened. And following the flood, you have famine, and then the dam will fill up. So this is low uptake thyrotoxicosis, and this is high uptake thyrotoxicosis. And these three conditions where the thyroid gland itself is the source of excess thyroid hormones, these three conditions are called as hyperthyroidism.
Okay. Another question. This is regarding plasmacytoma of thyroid gland. Is there any definite role of technetium-99 scan in this diagnosis of plasmacytoma?
No, plasmacytoma, FDG PET-CT is needed.
Is not. Oh, that
no,
is FDG is required.
Technetium thyroid scan is not good. You have to do FDG PET-CT. Plasmacytoma, thyroid lymphoma, usually they are rare, but and isolated thyroid lymphoma and isolated thyroid plasmacytomas are even more rare entities. So in all these conditions, you have to rule out any other sites in the body, any extrathyroidal site. So to see that, FDG PET-CT is an excellent investigation and is the investigation of choice.
And is there any role of radioiodine therapy for these patients?
No,
not at all. Yeah.
Usually thyroid lymphoma and thyroid plasmacytoma, they take it entirely different. They are like cancers.
Okay. And see, the women in childbearing age, one major concern for them, radioiodine therapy. You advise them?
Yes, sir. We have now, I told you, even endocrinologists nowadays, they refer for radioiodine therapy only. You in such cases, again, we give relatively higher dose, like at least 15 millicurie of iodine, blast the gland, make the patient hypothyroid, and then plan pregnancy.
Okay.
And make the patient hypothyroid, again start them on thyroxine supplements, render them euthyroid, then plan pregnancy, like 1 year after radioiodine therapy.
Yeah, somebody has asked, do you consider BMI for iodine therapy dose?
No, sir. That's what I told. Initially, we had to do all those dosimetric approach, but nowadays we follow fixed low dose or fixed high dose.
Okay. Do you advise pre-op PET-CT for thyroid cancer patients?
No, we don't advise unless it is a medullary CA thyroid. Differentiated thyroid cancer, post-operative iodine 131 scan is more important, not pre-operative scan. So for pre-operative, for surgical planning, you can consider either a CECT or MRI neck.
Yeah. Okay.
So systemic staging in pre-operative is not very important. And differentiated thyroid cancers are less FDG avid. So based on FDG avidity, we will not plan post-operative treatment. So for us, iodine uptake is more important than FDG uptake.
Okay. Dr. Kumar is asking any role of RAI in non-papillary variants, but well differentiated.
Yeah, well differentiated, definitely. Even in, I told you, as long as thyroid cancer, see, histopathological differentiation is different and in vivo differentiation is different. Okay. So even in Hurtl cell variants, insular variants, Stahl cell variants, they are more aggressive, they are less iodine 131 avid. But always it is good to do an iodine 131 scan post surgery. If the tissue picks up iodine 131, then we will give radioiodine therapy. But not in medullary CA thyroid.
Okay. And any role in anaplastic or poorly differentiated cancers?
No, anaplastic thyroid cancer usually don't take up radioiodine. So in anaplastic thyroid cancer, there is a limited role for surgery if it is picked up very early. But what is we have to consider is anaplastic thyroid cancer diagnosis is very difficult. And most of the times, a repeat biopsy or a good chunk of tissue is needed. Many a times anaplastic thyroid cancers turn out to be other variants. So that we have to bear in mind.
Okay.
Anaplastic thyroid cancer is very rare, and based on only one histopathological report may not be advisable. It is better to review the slides with another higher center, or you may even consider a repeat core biopsy. See, in thyroid nodules, that is why even in a relatively bigger thyroid nodule, if possible, always do a core biopsy rather than FNAC, because FNAC is highly prone for sampling errors.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Okay. If the patient had undergone pre-op CT with iodine contrast for thyroid cancer,
Mhm.
how long do you wait after the thyroid cancer operation for radiation therapy?
That is what I thought, sir. Nowadays, most
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
places we use non-ionized iodine contrast.
Okay.
So non-ionized iodine contrast gets cleared out of the body within 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And
Okay.
anyhow, after thyroid surgery, you are going to wait for 3 weeks.
That's true. Yeah.
And all you have to do is just follow iodine-free diet during these 3 weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Very impressive, Dr. Murli. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir. Thanks for this
Yeah,
opportunity.
we have another meeting on Thursday.
Yes, sir.
See, this is really good attendance, that too from all over the world.
Yes, sir.
Again, everybody will look forward for the Thursday's event.
Okay,
So
sir.
don't, when you end the meeting, don't switch off the system immediately. So it
Okay,
will,
okay.
the recording, it will
Okay.
convert and store on your hard disk.
Okay, sir.
Okay, that message
Sure.
will come. You wait after you end the meeting. Okay. So I
Okay,
will
sir.
leave now. I thank again everybody who are participated in the meeting. Again, I look forward for you all on Thursday. Okay. So I am leaving the meeting. Once you can end the meeting, Murli, you also. Huh?
Okay, sir. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir. Thank you.